Hello fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. I'm here today to tell you all about what it actually means now that we've moved over to the SiriusXM family. Big picture, it means we are going to make more content for you. Right now, you get one YouTube video a week on Saturday. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to have the Saturday upload be the same, but then also the MrBallen podcast. Well, we've begun already filming those episodes like a YouTube video. So that's a second piece of content every week. Then there's 2 other shows that you guys don't even know about yet, which means on any given week, you could have up to 4 new video pieces of content on the MrBallen channel. And also, all these pieces of content will double as podcasts as well. This new content schedule is going to start early next year. Also, there's one other thing I want to clarify, which is the state of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and Redacted. Those shows were created in collaboration with Wondery, but now we're partnered with Sirius, and so we're not going to be making any new episodes of either of those shows. For now, if you want to hear my podcast episodes 1 week early and ad-free, make sure to subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. Keep on the lookout for more announcements in the coming weeks. Thank you. On the evening of April 28, 2002, 38-year-old Rhonda Boggs sat on the couch of her mother-in-law's house in the quiet city of Pataskala, Ohio, nervously watching the clock. At her feet, her 2.5-year-old daughter, Amanda, was playing with a stuffed animal. It was 6:30 p.m., and Rhonda's husband, Dave, was supposed to call any minute. Dave was currently being incarcerated at the county jail. Dave had been sentenced to 2 weeks behind bars for failing to pay child support to one of his exes. And while Rhonda was obviously not thrilled about this, she also knew she should not be surprised. When Rhonda had first met Dave about 12 years earlier, it was his carefree personality that she had really fallen in love with. He was in a rock band, and she had loved going to his shows and dancing in the front row. It all felt glamorous and exciting and like they were going to stay young forever. But now they were both 38, with a toddler to look after, and bills to pay. And Dave, he really just kept on partying and playing rock star, while all their responsibilities sort of fell to Rhonda. She had barely been to any of his shows since Amanda had been born, in part because it wasn't really the kind of scene you could bring a baby to. A lot of the guys Dave hung around with were hard drinkers and drug addicts and ex-cons. And so now, after almost 4 years of marriage, Rhonda was finally starting to see Dave for what he was, which was not carefree. Dave was really just kind of reckless. The phone rang and Rhonda picked it up. And as expected, it was Dave. And what Rhonda really wanted to say to him was that she was upset and seriously considering divorce, and that in fact, she'd already taken his name off her retirement plan. But at the same time, she saw her mother-in-law standing in the doorway, clearly listening, and so instead of saying what she really wanted to say, she just said, "Hey Dave, how are you doing?" An hour later, back at her own home, Rhonda put a casserole into the oven, and then she turned on cartoons for Amanda, and then went outside to mow the lawn before it got too dark. Rhonda was used to doing almost everything around the house herself, since Dave was practically never home anyway. But now that he was, in jail, she had to literally do everything, including, mowing the grass on a Sunday night. So Rhonda wheeled the lawnmower out of the garage and into the yard, and then she pulled the cord to start the engine. But like everything else in their little house, the lawnmower was on the verge of breaking down, and it kept shutting off. While Rhonda struggled, she noticed her neighbor coming out of the house across the street, and he waved to Rhonda as he came down his own driveway, sort of telling her like, hey, turn off that lawnmower. And once she did, and once it was quiet enough to actually hear each other, he shouted from across the street and asked if she wanted to borrow his lawnmower that did work. Rhonda found herself looking around the yard at all the tall grass and saw how dark it was already getting. And then she checked her watch and saw that, her casserole was going to be done in just a minute here. And so she said to her neighbor that she really appreciated the offer, but it didn't really matter because, you know what, she doesn't have time to do this anyways. She has to go back inside. So Rhonda said bye to her neighbor, and then pushed her defective lawnmower back inside the garage, and then she made a mental note to call Dave's cousin, Nick, the following day to see if maybe he could come by and fix her lawnmower. Nick worked as a maintenance man at a big apartment complex, and even though he lived 45 minutes away, he'd been helping Rhonda around the house while Dave was behind bars. Just last week, he had fixed up her washing machine, and he called all the time just to check in. And so now, Rhonda went back inside the house, into the kitchen, and took the casserole out of the oven just before the timer rang. She cut the casserole into 2 pieces and brought those pieces into the dining room and set them on the table. Then she walked over and turned off the TV, scooped up her daughter, and brought her over to the table. It was getting late, and all Rhonda really wanted to do here was just eat quickly and go to bed. But for every bite that made it into Amanda's mouth, another wound up on the floor. And so Rhonda knew that, at the end of dinner, she would have to do another round of cleanup before she could finally go to sleep. But Rhonda knew, Amanda couldn't help it. She was a little kid. And so she reached over and took her daughter's fork and began helping her eat, to not only minimize the mess, but also to help her kid out. And in reality, Amanda was actually the thing preventing Rhonda from just pulling the trigger on a divorce. She didn't know if she could handle being a single mother. It was hard enough having Dave gone for a few weeks, that she couldn't even imagine doing this all alone by herself forever. And since she already knew Dave was bad at paying child support, as that is the reason he was in jail right now, she figured if she was a single mom, even if he was ordered to pay her, she would likely have to rely on paying the bills herself. She would need to get a job and make money. Now, Rhonda did have a job now as an office assistant, but she wasn't sure if that would be enough to fully support herself and her daughter without any additional financial help. But just then, as Rhonda was scooping up another bite of casserole for her daughter, she heard a noise outside that almost sounded like heavy footsteps. She turned around, and through the curtains, she could see the silhouette of a person clearly coming up her driveway. The next morning, Monday, April 29th, Rhonda's coworker, Gary Pulowski, noticed that Rhonda was running late for her shift in the office at Hamilton Home Products, which was a heating equipment company. And this was strange because Rhonda had actually never been late before in the entire time that she had worked there. So Gary began asking around to see if anybody knew where Rhonda was or if maybe she had called in or something. But his coworkers all shrugged and said they hadn't heard from her since she left the office on Friday night. And so eventually, Gary tried calling Rhonda's landline at her house to see if she was home. But after calling several times, Rhonda never picked up. He waited for a while to see if maybe she would call back, but when he still hadn't heard from her after an hour, he started to worry that, she might have run into car trouble, like maybe she was stranded somewhere with her car. He knew it was about a 15-mile drive from her house in Pataskala to the office here, just outside of Columbus. And back in 2002, not everyone had a cell phone, and he didn't know if she did. So if her car had broken down, she might be stranded without a way to call for help. And so Gary decided he would just get in his own car and drive the route from the office back to her house to literally see if he could find Rhonda on the side of the road. Gary drove all the way out to Pataskala, keeping his eyes peeled for Rhonda's car on the side of the road, but there was no sign of it. It was not until he finally turned the corner onto Rhonda's street that he saw her car, and her car was parked in the driveway of her white-paneled one-story house. And at this, Gary's stomach kind of balled up into a knot, because he realized that, Rhonda had clearly not left for work at all. And he knew that if she had just stayed home this whole time without calling in or calling anybody back, that something bad had to have happened. And so Gary pulled up to her house, and he got out of his car and walked up to the front door, and he knocked, but there was no answer. So after a minute, he went around and knocked on the back door, and there was still no answer back there either. So he walked back around to the front of the house, and he was about to leave when he saw the drapes rustling in one of the front windows. He squinted at the window, and he saw, what was causing the movement of the drapes was Rhonda's toddler daughter, Amanda, looking out the window. And her face was red like she'd been crying for a long time. And so now, Gary started to panic. But he tried to keep his voice calm as he ran over and shouted through the window and told Amanda he was a friend of her mother's and convinced her to open the door so he could help her. It took a minute for Amanda to figure out what Gary was asking, but eventually she got it, and she disappeared from the window, and a moment later, the front door opened. And so Gary walked over and he stepped through the front door, and the first thing he saw were bloody footprints on the living room carpet. Gary instinctively scooped Amanda up in his arms, and he ran across the street, banged on the neighbor's door, and told them to call the police. Not long after, Pataskala police would arrive at Rhonda's house, and they would search the inside, and they would find Rhonda, and she was found stabbed to death in her own kitchen. This was the first homicide in Pataskala in 6 years, and there were only 17 officers in the whole police department, and the crime scene unit was run out of a refurbished ambulance. So, Police Chief Chris Forshee didn't have a ton of resources to throw at this case, but he called in all available officers and sent them to the crime scene. And then he headed out there himself to make sure they did the job right. By the time Forshee pulled up to the house, his officers had already sealed off the perimeter. He ducked under the crime scene tape, walked inside the house, and followed the sound of footsteps and clicking cameras into the kitchen, where a woman was lying in a pool of blood on the tile floor. An officer told Forshee that the victim had been identified as Rhonda Boggs, and it was her coworker who had come to check on her when she hadn't shown up for work that morning that ultimately prompted a 911 call that led to the discovery of the body. The officer also told Forshee that Rhonda's toddler daughter had been found, uninjured, in the house with her body, and so Forshee knelt down to examine the body. And right away, he saw at least, more than a dozen stab wounds on Rhonda's head, her neck, her chest, and her shoulders. The sheer number of wounds and the blood all over the kitchen suggested there had to have been a struggle, and that from the looks of it, Rhonda had fought very hard with her attacker. The remnants of what appeared to be a casserole were sitting on the stove, and Rhonda was fully dressed. So Forshee figured the crime must have happened sometime before she went to bed, so between dinner and bedtime. And then Forshee wondered if, her poor daughter had been awake, or maybe even in the room, when this happened. After the scene had been photographed, Forshee gave the green light for the coroner to actually physically lift Rhonda's body up off the ground onto a stretcher. And when the coroner's staff hoisted her up, Forshee noticed something lying underneath her body. It was a steak knife with blood all over the blade. Forshee looked around the kitchen and realized the black handle on that knife matched the set of knives on the countertop. It appeared that Rhonda had been killed with a knife from her own kitchen, which meant her killer did not show up to the house with their murder weapon. This suggested that this murder was likely a heat-of-the-moment crime, rather than something that had been planned out. While Forshee's officers finished collecting forensic evidence in the kitchen, Forshee himself walked through the rest of the house. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. The jewelry box in the bedroom was empty, and the dresser drawers were open, and piles of Rhonda's clothes were strewn all over the floor. And then in the dining room, they found a purse that had been overturned with all of its contents spilled out, and clearly it looked like somebody had been sifting through it. And so Forshee thought that, between the sort of ransacked appearance of the house and also the weapon of opportunity, that it seemed like this could have been a robbery gone wrong. However, there was one factor that did seem to complicate things, or at least make it seem like this could have been something else, and that was that there was no sign of forced entry. Just then, Forshee heard a commotion near the front door, and so he walked over, and he saw there was a woman trying to push her way into the house, and her face was all red, and she was crying, and she was shouting at the officers, demanding to know what happened. Forshee took this woman outside and tried to calm her down, and she would eventually tell him that her name was Kim Davis and she was Rhonda's sister. Once she'd caught her breath, Forshee explained to her what he already knew, which was that unfortunately her sister Rhonda had been found stabbed to death inside of her home, and the running theory at this point, at least his theory, was this was a robbery gone wrong. And potentially, because there was no sign of forced entry, it could indicate that it was somebody that, Rhonda potentially knew and who she would have, let into the house if she saw them. Now, Kim was obviously extremely upset by this, and so for a minute, Forshee just consoled her, but he really needed to kind of press this investigation, and so once she had kind of calmed down a little bit, he asked her if she knew of anybody who might have wanted to hurt Rhonda. And Kim immediately said no. She couldn't imagine her sister having any enemies. But after sitting with that question for a moment, Kim said that actually, there was one person who might have had a problem with Rhonda, and that was her husband, Dave. Kim said that Rhonda and Dave's marriage had been on the rocks for a while, and in fact, Rhonda had told her recently that she was thinking about getting a divorce. But Kim said, Dave actually is currently in jail, so I don't see how he could have done this. He was literally in jail at the time this happened. Still, though, she thought it was possible that, Dave could have been involved one way or another. He might have paid somebody to come here and do this, or maybe put one of his friends up to it. Forshee promised Kim he would look into this, But he was already feeling pretty skeptical. I mean, if Dave couldn't even pay child support, what was the likelihood that he was able to afford a hitman? And also, the murder weapon appeared to come from Rhonda's kitchen. And so that didn't really suggest that the suspect had been planning to kill her when they got there. So again, sort of takes away from the idea that a hitman was used in this murder. But at this point, Forshee thought their best chance to figure out what actually happened here was actually to speak to the only other person who was at the scene of the crime that they knew about. And that was Rhonda's own 2-year-old daughter, Amanda. Later that day, a social worker from Child Services pulled up outside the house, and Forshee walked out to greet her. And he said to her that before she took custody of Amanda, he was hoping that, she could help him talk to this girl and see what she knew about the murder, because she was here, when it happened, and there was nobody else who witnessed it but her. The social worker nodded, and so Forshee took her across the street to the neighbor's house, where Amanda had been staying all morning. Now, Forshee didn't know if this little girl would be able to tell them anything at all. I mean, of course, she could be in complete shock. She's also 2. And he also knew that even if she did tell them stuff, they wouldn't necessarily be reliable because, again, she's 2 years old and she very likely is in shock. But regardless, Forshee knew he had to try. So he stood in the corner of the living room while the social worker sat down on the floor with Amanda and asked her what she had seen the night before. And to Forshee's surprise, the little girl looked up at the social worker and she jerked her little hand toward her neck in what looked very much like a stabbing motion. And then in a quiet voice, she said her mother had fallen down and gone to sleep. Then the social worker asked her if anybody else had been there. And Forshee felt himself holding his breath, waiting for Amanda to answer. And there was a moment of silence before Amanda said, "Uncle Nick." A few hours later, Chief Forshee was still at the crime scene when 2 officers pulled up in a cruiser and took this grungy-looking man out of the back seat and escorted him into the house. This was not the Uncle Nick that Amanda had named. It was Amanda's own father, Dave Boggs, who had been in jail when his wife was murdered. Now, Forshee was absolutely planning to speak to this Uncle Nick, but first he wanted to gather as much information as possible about him. During Amanda's conversation with the social worker, she had said repeatedly that Uncle Nick had hurt Mommy. But even though this 2-year-old girl seemed very definitive about this, Forshee needed an adult perspective before he acted. A judge had let Dave Boggs out of jail early because of his wife's murder, and Forshee had ensured that Dave was escorted to the crime scene so Forshee could speak to him before Dave got a chance to speak to anybody else. And so now Forshee met Dave and the officers at the door and then guided them into the living room where they sat Dave down on the couch. They filled him in on what had happened to his wife, but really before he could react to that, they also told him that they needed him to do a walkthrough of the house with them to try to identify what might have been stolen, which could help them figure out who did this. But first, Forshee said he had a very important question. He asked Dave, "Who is Uncle Nick?" And at this, Dave, who to this point had just looked completely shocked by what he was being told, began to look more confused. And he told Forshee that Uncle Nick was what his daughter called his second cousin. He said his real name was Richard Nicholas Robinson, and he had been helping Rhonda out while Dave was in jail. Dave said Nick had probably been at the house almost every day, fixing one thing or another. But he said he didn't understand why Forshee was asking about him because, there's no way he would have hurt Rhonda. I mean, he really looked out for her and also for Amanda. But for now, Forshee was not going to answer that question. Dave's information was enough for him to go outside, get on his radio, and broadcast a bulletin asking all police departments in the area to be on the lookout for Nick Robinson. Less than an hour later, a police cruiser found Nick Robinson's SUV on State Route 37 just outside of Pataskala, and they pulled him over and they ordered him out of the vehicle, and as soon as he was out, they pushed him to the ground with a gun to the back of his head and cuffed him. And as they did this, they noticed a dark spot on Nick's baseball cap that looked a lot like blood. As they put Nick in the back of the cruiser, he kept asking them what was going on, but they didn't tell him. Instead, they searched his SUV, and there was cardboard laid out in the back with reddish-brown smears all over it, which also appeared to be blood. And then when the officers got back into their cruiser, Nick asked them, "Is this about Rhonda?" By the time this arrest happened, Chief Forshee was at Nick Robinson's house questioning his wife, Debbie. So while he did that, he dispatched one of his best and only detectives, Bruce Brooks, to go down to police headquarters to handle Nick's interrogation. When Detective Brooks walked into the interview room, immediately he could see that Nick, who was resting his head in his hands, looked very pale and nauseous. When he asked him if he was okay, Nick said he was just hungover from a long night of drinking. He said he had been at a bar in Columbus until around 10:30 p.m., and then he had gone to another bar in Lancaster, which was a town nearby where he lived. And then he had finally come home around 1:30 a.m. and passed out on his couch. Nick swore he didn't know anything about what happened to Rhonda, and only found out she was dead when he saw it on the news. And as for the blood the police found in his SUV, he said it was just animal blood from a hunting trip. But Brooks was not buying this, because he had heard Amanda, Rhonda's daughter, say Uncle Nick hurts Mom. And while, of course, you can't take a 2-year-old's testimony as absolutely reliable, but when she had said it, she said it very definitively and even gestured at her neck like she was stabbing herself. And Rhonda was found stabbed to death. So he asked Nick, if his alibi essentially was that he was too drunk to have committed this murder. Well, then how could he be sure, given he was too drunk, that he hadn't killed Rhonda in an alcohol-fueled blackout? If he can't remember, it's just as likely that he could have done it. But Nick just shook his head and said no. And no seemed to be Nick's answer to just about every question Brooks asked him. And eventually, the detective got frustrated, because basically everything he asked Nick, he denied. And so eventually he told Nick that Rhonda's daughter had seen the whole thing. And he told him to imagine that little girl on the witness stand, having some defense lawyer poke and prod her about the most traumatic event she had ever experienced, the murder of her own mother. And when he said that, a crack seemed to appear in Nick's sort of outward demeanor of denial. Like clearly he saw how awful this thing really was. And then finally, a little after midnight, so 6 hours into this interrogation, Nick just agreed to take a lie detector test. And when the results came back, it showed very clearly that Nick had failed. He had lied. But instead of confessing at this point, Nick dug in and swore up and down that he really was innocent. So Brooks pulled out the last threat he could think of, which was that if Nick didn't confess now, he could be looking at the death penalty. And at that point, it was very clear. Nick cracked. That absolutely affected him. And so after a long silence following this threat of the death penalty, Nick said that, maybe he did have something to do with what happened, but he just couldn't remember it. From there on, Brooks kept on pushing and pushing until around 5 a.m. when Nick finally completely broke down and confessed to the murder. He said he had gone to Rhonda's house in between the 2 bars that he had visited, and he tried to kiss her. She pulled away and she grabbed a knife, and when Nick tried to take the knife from her, he said he accidentally stabbed her. As the sun came up, officers drove Nick to the Licking County Jail and officially booked him for Rhonda's murder. Later that morning, Chief Forshee stood in front of a group of reporters outside the police station and praised his officers for catching Rhonda Boggs' killer and getting a confession in less than 24 hours. But later that week, Detective Brooks was in his office wrapping up paperwork when a secretary stuck her head in the door and said there was somebody on the phone for him. Brooks picked it up, and the man on the other end of the line introduced himself as Bob Cisco. And he said he was the bandmate of Rhonda's husband, Dave Boggs, and he did not think Nick was guilty of this murder. Bob said on the evening that Rhonda was killed, another one of their former bandmates, a guy named Chris Williams, had stopped by his house. And Chris had seemed very nervous and sort of keyed up. He was pacing around and smoking cigarette after cigarette, and it just seemed like he was very mentally preoccupied with something. Now, Bob said Chris had actually in the past already robbed Rhonda and Dave's house. He had stolen a bunch of band equipment and sold it for drug money. And so when Bob Cisco saw on the news that, Rhonda was dead and her house appeared to have been robbed, he couldn't shake this feeling that Chris might have been involved. It just seemed too similar to be a coincidence. Brooks wrote all this down and thanked Bob for the information, but he wasn't sure how seriously to take this tip, since they already had a confession from their primary suspect. But he spoke to Forshee, and the chief decided to go ahead and re-interview Rhonda's 2-year-old daughter, just to cover their bases. A few days later, so about 2 weeks after Rhonda's murder, Chief Forshee waited by the phone in his office, anxiously watching the clock. He knew that the social worker who had spoken to Amanda the first time was in the process of interviewing her a second time. And any minute now, this social worker should be calling him with an update. Now, Forshee was hopeful that the little girl would just repeat the same story that she had told on the day of her mother's murder. But when his phone finally rang and Forshee picked it up, he learned that that is not what happened. The social worker said that this time, when she asked Amanda who she saw on the night of the murder, she did not say anything about Uncle Nick. Instead, she said, Bob did it. When Forshee heard this, he immediately got a pretty anxious feeling. He'd been afraid from the beginning that, a toddler was not a reliable eyewitness, and she could just be throwing out whatever names popped into her head. But he also thought it was a very strange coincidence that of all the people she could have named other than Uncle Nick, she said Bob. The same guy who had just called the station trying to, cast blame onto some other guy the police had never even heard of. Something just felt off. But as Forshee thought about it, he decided, it didn't really change anything. Nick had already confessed, like he said he did this. So they didn't really need Amanda as a witness to make the charges against Nick stick. 5 days later, a grand jury officially indicted Nick on murder charges. And to the huge surprise of investigators, Nick pled not guilty. So he was now claiming he had given a false confession and that he was not Rhonda Boggs' killer. About 7 months later, in December of 2002, a man named Matt Sauer stepped into a bar called Merry Melodies in Columbus, Ohio. He went up to the counter and pulled a manila folder out of his messenger bag, and he asked the bartender if he recognized the man in the photograph inside. The bartender looked down at the photo for a second and then looked back up at Sauer and nodded and said, "Yes, that's Nick Robinson. He was here 8 months ago, on the night of the murder, and I've been waiting for you guys to come here and talk to me about it, because I know he was here on the night of the murder." Sauer was kind of caught off guard by how sure the bartender was, and so he asked them, how can you be so sure it was him, and how do you know he was here on the night of the murder? How can you remember that? But the bartender had a quick answer. He said the reason he remembered Nick is he had been wearing this very unique, unforgettable t-shirt that night with this obscene joke on it about women's bodies, so he just remembered it. Bartender said Nick had stayed there on the night of the murder until 10:15 or maybe 10:30. The bartender was absolutely certain. And so again, the bartender said to Sauer, I'm just pretty surprised it took this long for you all to come here and confirm his whereabouts. I've known this. Sauer closed his folder and thanked the bartender, and then just set his business card down on the counter. And when the bartender picked it up, he looked surprised, because Matt Sauer was not actually a police officer. He was a private investigator, and he'd been hired by Nick Robinson to clear his name. Sauer knew this was going to be a tough job, because Nick had already confessed to Rhonda Boggs' murder. But Sauer was hoping that this interview with the bartender would help him poke a massive hole in the case against him. And so now that Sauer had gotten this testimony from the bartender that did appear to poke this hole in the case, Sauer left the bar, got in his car, and drove to the second bar Nick had claimed to be at on the night of Rhonda's murder. It was called the Fairview Inn in Lancaster. And when he got there, he showed that staff the same photo, and just like the first bartender, they all remembered Nick as well. They said he was there on the night of April 28th, the night of the murder, and they remembered because of his distinctive t-shirt. And so now Sauer knew he was onto something, because the prosecution's case said that Nick had left Merry Melodies bar, that first bar Sauer had gone to, driven to Rhonda's house and killed her, and then went to this bar, the Fairview Inn. But the staff at both bars said Nick was wearing this same distinctive t-shirt. And Sauer knew that if Nick had stabbed Rhonda to death in between these two bars, wouldn't that shirt have been covered in blood? And wouldn't, the Fairview Inn staff have not just remembered that it was this distinctive shirt, but the distinctive shirt that had blood all over it? That would also be a detail they would recall. But they didn't. They just said he had that shirt on, nothing else. A few days later, Sauer drove back to Merry Melodies bar. But this time he didn't go inside. Instead, he just pulled his car into their parking lot and started his stopwatch. And then once it was going, he pulled out of the parking lot, turned down the street, and drove all the way to Fairview Inn. And when he reached their parking lot, he checked his stopwatch, and the drive had taken, about 45 minutes. The prosecution's case against Nick had him leaving Merry Melody's bar, murdering Rhonda, and driving all the way to the Fairview, all within 30 to 45 minutes. But Sowers' experiment here with his stopwatch proved there was simply no way for Nick to have driven all the way to Rhonda's house, committed the murder, and then made it back to the Fairview Inn in that same window of time. It just wasn't possible, which meant Nick's alibi was airtight and he could not have been the killer. Now, Sauer just had to figure out who actually was. Matt Sauer showed the evidence he had found to Nick's defense attorney, who then brought that evidence to the judge in the case, and they also asked the judge for an order to test a key piece of evidence that the Pataskala police had never even sent to the crime lab, the murder weapon. And so the judge agreed to test the knife, and a month later, in January of 2003, the evidence came back from the lab, and they discovered there was DNA on the knife from someone other than Rhonda. Investigators were not sure who the DNA belonged to, because back in 2003, it isn't like you had this huge bank to test it against. You basically had to test DNA one-to-one. But they were able to do that with Nick's DNA, and were able to confirm that it was not his DNA on the murder weapon. And so this cast serious doubt on Nick as a suspect, but it wasn't enough to clear his name. Not until Sauer could figure out who that other set of DNA belonged to. And so Sauer dug through the police files on the case, and he realized there were a lot of potential suspects the police had never even bothered to look at closely, or at all. There was Rhonda's soon-to-be ex-husband, Dave, who'd been flagged by Rhonda's sister on day one. Dave obviously could not have committed the murder himself because he was in jail. But, like the sister suggested, it's possible he could have recruited somebody else to do it. And so all of Dave's friends, his acquaintances, the people he met in jail potentially, were suspects too. There was also Chris Williams, the former bandmate who had previously robbed Dave and Rhonda's house once before and sold Dave's guitars for drug money. And of course, there was Bob Sisko, the man who had actually called in the tip about Chris. And at one point, Rhonda's own daughter had said Bob had been in the house during the murder. And so maybe that was Bob Sisko. Any of those people could have been Rhonda's killer. But since there was so little investigation done, Sauer was essentially starting over from square one, almost 9 months after the crime. The killer could even be somebody who the police never even knew about, because they had never really even bothered to focus on anybody but Nick. And so with little concrete to go off of, Sauer decided that, before he began investigating 87 different people, he would start with the sort of one concrete thing he had, which is they knew what items had been taken from Rhonda's house during the murder. And so what he decided he would do is try to track down those items, and hopefully they would lead him to the actual killer. A few days later, Sauer stepped into a pawn shop in Columbus and walked slowly down the aisle, scanning the shelves for some of the items that he knew had been taken from Rhonda and Dave's house. But like all the other pawn shops he'd been to that day, he hadn't found anything, and when he got to the end of this aisle, he knew this pawn shop as well did not have any of these missing items. Now, it was entirely possible that the items that had been stolen had not been pawned off yet, or maybe they had been pawned off in some other part of the country or something, but it just seemed kind of likely that if they had been pawned, they might be sort of roughly in the area. But so far, he had not found anything promising. And so after leaving this pawn shop and going to another and then another and still not finding any of the stolen items, Sauer finally decided to call it a day and head back home. However, on his ride back home, Sauer found himself stopped at a stoplight. And as he was idling there, he just happened to look out the window, and on the other side of the road, he saw a Bureau of Motor Vehicles, a DMV. And when he saw the DMV, it was like something kind of rattled loose in his mind. He remembered that one of the persons of interest on his list had been arrested for car theft about a week after Rhonda's murder. But, according to the police files, that suspect owned a car of their own. a blue Cadillac. So why would they need to steal another car if they already owned one? And so on a whim, Sauer pulled into the parking lot of this DMV. He went inside and he went up to one of the clerks and he asked them to look into this particular blue Cadillac. He gave the clerk the license plate number and he quickly found out that on April 30th, 2002, so one day after Rhonda's body had been found, that blue Cadillac had been sold to a woman in Columbus whose name was Letitia Gordon. And so Sauer left the DMV and drove straight to Letitia's house, and he knocked on the door. And the woman who opened it looked a bit scared when he introduced himself as an investigator, but she also did not seem surprised. Letitia told Sauer that she knew why he was there. It was because of the blue Cadillac that she had bought. She said that she had bought that car off a stranger right off the street who had offered to sell it to her for just $300, something she couldn't pass up. However, when she got home with this new car, she looked inside of it, and she found there was all this stuff piled up in the back of the car, which included clothes, jewelry, and a purse with somebody's photo ID inside. And the name on that ID was Rhonda Boggs. And so, with his suspicions now confirmed, Sauer was finally able to reconstruct what really happened to Rhonda Boggs on the night of April 28, 2002. On that night, while Rhonda Boggs was finishing up dinner with her 2-year-old daughter, her killer was parking their blue Cadillac just down the block. They eventually got out and stormed over to Rhonda's house in a total fury, with their heart pounding and their heads swimming, and they stomped up her driveway and they rang the doorbell. And when Rhonda opened up the door, she looked confused and a bit scared to see this person. She asked them what they were doing there, but the killer just brushed past her and stormed into her house, into the kitchen, and began digging through her purse right on the counter. Rhonda tried to stop them, but when she put her hands on them, the killer, without any hesitation, grabbed a nearby steak knife and stabbed Rhonda in the chest. Rhonda, she fell to the ground and tried to stand back up and tried to defend herself, but the killer was on top of her, stabbing her over and over and over again until Rhonda was no longer moving. The killer at that point stood up and backed away from Rhonda's body, which was now lying there in a pool of blood on the kitchen tile. And then they just proceeded to ransack the house and stole whatever money and valuables they could find. And then as they were about to leave, they saw a toddler just standing in the hallway, watching them. The killer paid the child no mind and just hurried right past them out of the house, got back into their blue Cadillac, and spent the rest of the night on a massive drug binge. And then the next morning, they sold that blue Cadillac to a woman in Columbus on the street, accidentally leaving Rhonda's stolen purse, her ID, and jewelry in the back of that car. And nearly a year later, those items would lead investigators to the killer. The killer was Chris Williams, Dave Boggs' former bandmate who had robbed him and Rhonda once before. On the night of the murder, he was high on crack and needed money for his next hit, and Rhonda unfortunately got in the way. Chris was charged with Rhonda's murder, and on March 28, 2005, he was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 20 years to life for Rhonda's murder and a total of 28 years for aggravated robbery, burglary, and escaping from a halfway house. After Chris Williams was charged, all the charges against Nick Robinson were dropped. And for Nick Robinson, this completely changed his life, not just because now he was free, but once he came back home, he stopped drinking and he returned to work, and he sued the city of Pataskala for $3 million in damages. Rachel Berkheimer was born on January 16, 1984 in Everett, Washington, which is a city that is located 25 miles north of Seattle and sits on the banks of the Puget Sound, which is a large inlet of the Pacific Ocean. At the time of her birth, Rachel's parents, Bill and Denise, already had one child, a daughter named Megan, and so when Rachel arrived, they decided their family was complete. Initially, there was some concern that Rachel could have some health issues because by the time she was 2.5 years old, she still was not talking, and so her parents were concerned she could be deaf. But shortly after they went to a specialist about her hearing, Rachel would say her first words, and then from that point onward, her parents could not get her to be quiet. As a youngster, Rachel had a huge imagination. In preschool, she would pretend her fingers were imaginary friends and she would speak to them during class, often getting in trouble because of this. She also had a prized collection of troll dolls, who she gave very intricate backstories to. By the time Rachel was in grade school, she had developed a keen sense of humor. Specifically, she had the gift of mimicry. She could basically become any of her friends or her family members, and everyone thought it was really funny. In addition to her bubbly personality, Rachel was also a very gifted athlete who was always one of the very best players on her basketball, soccer, volleyball, or track team. All this despite growing to be only 4 foot 11 inches tall. Speaking of her smaller stature, even though she was not self-conscious about it, Rachel did wear 4-inch platform shoes virtually everywhere she went, including just going out to the mailbox. In high school, unsurprisingly, Rachel became very popular. Her father joked that he was her answering machine because her many friends would call the house day and night looking for her. But despite this abundance of friends, Rachel took all of her relationships very seriously. She never forgot anybody's birthday, and she would even sometimes send out these random cards that weren't even on birthdays to her friends and to her family members, just telling them how much she loved them. By 2001, when Rachel was 17 years old and in her 3rd year of high school, it just seemed like she was this amazing person who was destined to live a totally charmed life. However, this would not last. Of all of her friends, Rachel's best friend was an 18-year-old boy named Corey Haynes. She had met him when they were young, and they had quickly become soulmates, at least according to their families. However, their relationship was not a romantic one. It was more of a brother-sister style relationship. They spent nearly all of their time together, and in the rare times they were not together, they could always be found speaking on the phone. In the summer following Rachel's 3rd year of high school, Corey was riding in a car with 3 other students from his and Rachel's school. Rachel was not with them. And at some point, the driver of the vehicle lost control of it and started to flip off the road. And when it finally came to a stop 100 feet away from the road, Corey and one of the other student passengers, a 17-year-old named Levi Whiting, were both unfortunately deceased. When Rachel heard the news about this crash, she fell apart. Not only was Corey literally her best friend in the world, but she was also very close with Levi as well. And so over the rest of that awful summer, Rachel spent most of her time crying in her bedroom, looking at pictures of her and Corey and her and Levi. Her older sister, Megan, would say that Rachel was just beyond heartbroken. It was like all of the joy and happiness that normally characterized her was just gone. Finally, that summer did come to an end, and it was time for Rachel to return to Marysville-Pilchuck High School to begin her 4th and final year. Her family hoped that finally being around some other students again would help heal her and help her move on, but unbelievably, over the course of that school year, 4 more students, all of whom were friends with Rachel, would die. There was a suicide, there was a drowning, a hit and run, and an accidental shooting. It was like the school was cursed. By the second half of that school year, Rachel, like many other students at the school, had become deeply depressed. The trauma of losing so many people close to her had just crushed her spirit. When her grades, which were normally quite good, began to decline dramatically, her parents pulled her from the high school and enrolled her in an alternative high school. They also began sending her to grief counseling. But not long after joining this alternative high school did Rachel drop out, so she did not get her high school diploma. Her parents were not happy about this decision, but they did understand their child's life had been completely disrupted in a catastrophic way over the past year. I mean, the trauma she had experienced already as this young person was more than what most adults would experience in their entire lifetime. And so they honored their daughter's decision to drop out, and they just gave her some space to try to figure out what she wanted to do next. After dropping out of school in the spring of 2002, Rachel got a job at a local pizza and pasta shop in town, but after only a couple of months, she quit. She did pick up some hours babysitting that summer, but for the most part, she spent her time just sitting in her room, alone and sad. Then one day, her father looked at the family's phone bill and saw it was significantly higher than normal. When he reviewed all of the individual charges, he saw there was one that really stood out to him. There were dozens and dozens of collect calls that had been placed from an inmate at a correctional facility. When he confronted his daughter about these calls, she would tell him that yes, she was speaking to an inmate at a correctional facility, and his name was John Anderson. He was 20 years old. He went by Diggy, that was his nickname, and that she and Diggy were in this sort of new romantic relationship. She told her father that she had met Diggy a year earlier at a high school party. This was before he was sent to jail on drug and burglary charges, and he had been very interested in her at the time, but she wasn't interested in him. Despite the rejection, though, Diggy continued to pursue Rachel well after this party, but it wasn't until a year later, when she had dropped out of high school, that she finally decided to give him a shot. Rachel would tell her father that Diggy, despite being a convicted criminal, was very misunderstood. He was actually a very nice guy who just had a troubled past, and that was why he kept getting in trouble with the law. Her father did not approve and was very worried about his daughter, but he wanted to be supportive and felt like he didn't really know the whole situation, and so he just told her, please just be careful. Not long after this father-daughter talk, Diggy got out of prison, and so Rachel, who had spent the better part of the last year shut up in her room, was now suddenly going out all the time to see him and his group of friends. It's important to understand here that Diggy and his group of friends were in reality just a group of petty criminals and drug dealers for the most part. However, they thought of themselves as a full-fledged, organized criminal gang, and they were very proud of it. And they even referred to themselves as the Northwest Mafia. And Diggy was very clearly their leader. Quickly, it became apparent to Rachel's family that a big part of, quote, spending time with Diggy and the Northwest Mafia was partying and doing drugs and drinking alcohol. And so naturally, the parents were very concerned for their daughter, who they felt was really starting to go down the wrong path in life. So over the next couple of months, Rachel's parents and her sister all tried to gently convince Rachel to stop spending so much time with Diggy and his crew because they were a totally bad influence on her. But Rachel was adamant that Diggy and his crew was making her happy, and that right now that was what she needed, that she needed to be around them, that they were really just awesome people, and that you got to trust her. And her family, they didn't trust her. They felt like, maybe she's going through a phase where she wants to date, a bad boy. They didn't really get it, but they also didn't have a way of getting through to her. It seemed like she was just convinced this is what she needed to be doing now, and so they just were kind of at a loss. Then, one day, it seemed like everything had just magically fallen into place. It was on a sunny morning in late July of that year. Rachel's father was outside working on his garden when his daughter, Rachel, suddenly appeared looking happier than she had in a long time. Bill smiled back at her and was like, "What's going on? Why are you so happy?" And she would tell him that she had a plan. She was going back to school and she was going to become a medical technician. And she was just absolutely beaming as she's telling him this news. When she was asked what had brought about this incredible change, she explained that she had recently made a new friend who was encouraging her to do this. She said his name was Maurice Rivas. He was 18 years old like she was, and he was a part of the Northwest Mafia. She told her dad that she had previously interacted with him when she first started seeing Diggy a few months earlier, but she had never really had a real conversation with him. She'd only just kind of waved and said hi whenever they were at gatherings together. But a few days earlier, when she was at a Northwest Mafia party, she and Maurice just kind of happened to find themselves alone, and so they struck up a friendly conversation. And during that talk, Maurice confided in Rachel that he was actually really unhappy, and he wanted to leave the Northwest Mafia, and he wanted to go back to school since he had actually dropped out of high school as well. And when Rachel heard him say this, she had an epiphany. She realized she felt exactly the way he did. She didn't like being in the Northwest Mafia. She didn't even know why she was in the Northwest Mafia. She didn't know why she was seeing Diggy, and it was like it all clicked for her. And so she confided in Maurice, this guy who she barely knew. She said, "You know what? I feel the same way. I don't want to spend time with these people. I want to go back to school." And so this random conversation they had at this party really immediately bonded them together. It was like they both had been harboring this deep, dark secret, but now only with each other, they could discuss it openly. And it was very liberating for them. And so by the end of this first real conversation they had had, the pair had promised each other that they were going to get out of the Northwest Mafia, they were going to go back to school, they were going to clean up their acts, they were going to fix their lives, and they were going to do it together. They were going to support each other and have each other's back. Rachel would even joke with her father that they were already talking about when they went back to school that they would go to senior prom together, although she assured her dad that their relationship was totally platonic. This was not a romantic thing. Bill, her father, had no idea what to say. This was literally the best case scenario. It was the thing her family had been hoping for over these last several months, and it seemed like it was finally happening. And so he told Rachel he was so proud of her. He gave her a big hug and said, look, if you need anything, just let me know. And Rachel smiled and she gave him a hug back, and then she turned around and skipped back inside the house. And sure enough, over the next 2 months, Rachel did act very differently. She started very intentionally getting her life back together. She started spending more time at home with her family, and she started going to church with her mom, and she also began reconnecting with some of her older high school friends who had always been a positive influence on her. And so by September of that year, Rachel did seem like she was more or less back to her old happy self. Except there was one element of her life, of her old life, so to speak, that she was not able to shake. And that was her relationship with Diggy. She just could not end it. She had tried to, but apparently he didn't want to break up. And so they fell into this sort of weird on and off again relationship that kept Rachel periodically going back to these Northwest Mafia gatherings. Her family was obviously unhappy about this particular detail, but they did feel confident that given her recent changes, that she would eventually break it off for good with Diggy. And so until that happened, they were actually quietly grateful that her new friend Maurice was also still spending time with the Northwest Mafia. He too was kind of struggling to fully break contact with them. And so the family was thinking, well, yeah, they do need to leave, but for the time being, when they're at these gatherings, at least they'll have each other. On September 23rd of that year, Rachel was invited to a Northwest Mafia get-together, and she did agree to go. Before she left her house, she did not give her family very much information about what she was doing or where she was going. All they knew was that apparently she was going out to see some friends. And so that night, when Rachel did not come back home, her family was definitely concerned about her, but they assumed she must have made plans to stay out at this friend or friend's house for the night. And since she didn't have a cell phone, they couldn't call her to confirm that, and so they just had to wait until the next day to see if she would show up again. But the next day arrived, and Rachel did not show up again, and when her family began calling around to her various friends' houses, both old and new, no one seemed to know where she was. For a couple of days, the family continued to call around town and even drove around town putting up posters, asking people to come forward if they had seen her, but there was no sign of her. And so finally, on September 27th, the family went to police and they officially reported Rachel missing. The police immediately jumped into action, sending out units to scour all corners of Everett, Washington, and the surrounding areas. They also began questioning virtually anyone who was even remotely affiliated with Rachel in hopes they might know something. But despite this really aggressive initial push by police, it led to nothing. Then, out of nowhere, someone very unexpected came forward and gave the police a huge tip. And this tip would ultimately lead police to discover the truly unbelievable story of what happened to Rachel. The following is that story. After leaving her house on the afternoon of September 23rd, the day she told her family she was going to see friends, Rachel made the short drive over to 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace's house. He was going to be the host for that evening's get-together with the Northwest Mafia. When she arrived, Nathan, along with Rachel's good friend Maurice and a 17-year-old named Matthew Durham, were sitting in the living room, and while they waited for more friends of theirs to arrive, Nathan's father suddenly came home. Apparently, he had gotten off work early, and so not wanting to hang out around the prying eyes of a parent, the trio decided it would be better if they just left and spent their night at someone else's house. And so they made their way over to Kevin Jihad's house. Kevin was a 32-year-old, and he owned his own place. When they arrived, they found Kevin, along with 22-year-olds John Whitaker and Jeffrey Barth, and 20-year-old Tony Williams, all sitting around in the living room, just kind of joking around. They're playing video games, they're drinking alcohol, and they're smoking marijuana. Rachel, along with Maurice, Nathan, and Matthew, just took up spots on the couch right near the entrance to the room, and before long, they were joking around and having a good time too. At 4 p.m., Rachel's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Diggy, stormed into Kevin's living room looking furious. Without warning, he punched two of the guys sitting nearest Rachel, and then he pulled out a gun and he began aiming it wildly around the room. And this instantly silenced the group because no one knew what he was on about. And Rachel, who's sitting right near the door, she does not want to be part of this, and she's thinking this has nothing to do with me, and so she decides she's going to get up and kind of slip out and let them deal with Diggy and whatever is going on in here. And so she stands up, trying to be as quiet and small as she can, and she begins edging towards the door. But in order to fully leave the living room and escape this situation, she would need to walk right past Diggy, who was standing in the doorway. And as she got closer to him, about to make that move out of the room, Diggy seemed to notice her, and he put his gun down, and he turned to face her, and then he turned his whole body so he was squared up with Rachel, as if he was getting ready to fight her. And then Rachel just kind of tried to make herself as small and as timid as she possibly could, and she tried to just slip past him, but right as she did, Diggy reached out with his left hand, and he grabbed her scalp, he grabbed her hair, and then he wound up and he blasted her in the face with his right hand, and then with his left, he kind of chucked her back into the room she had just tried to escape from. And then the worst night of Rachel's life would begin. As soon as she hit the floor in that room, she tried to scramble back to her feet, but before she could, she was getting punched and kicked by Diggy and several other of her friends who had just been sitting in the room joking around with her, and then the others who were in the room who were not actively participating in beating her, which included Maurice Rivas. They sat there idly doing nothing while Rachel screamed for their help. When her screams got so loud, Diggy was concerned the neighbors would hear her. One of the idle onlookers in the room, 20-year-old Tony Williams, simply turned the music up to drown her screams out. After a few horrible, violent minutes, Diggy told the others to stop, at which point he reached down and he grabbed Rachel's hair again and dragged her out of the room, and then he dragged her across the kitchen floor and through a door that led into the garage. Once she was inside the garage, he jammed a dirty sock into her mouth and he covered her mouth over with duct tape, and then he bound her wrists and her body with rope, and then once he was certain she could neither make any noise or go anywhere, he pushed her over so she was laying on her side all bound up, and then he just left. He went back into the house and back into the living room with the others. What Rachel was not aware of was this entire night was a setup. Diggy was furious with her, most likely due to a combination of rage that she had tried to break up with him and just jealousy that she was now showing affection to other men in the group, such as Maurice and a few others. And so Diggy had ordered the other members of the Northwest Mafia to help put her in her place. It was unclear exactly what he meant by this, but all of the Mafia members knew this meant physically harming Rachel in some way, and they agreed to it. Originally, the plan had been to lure her to Nathan's house under the false pretenses of just a normal night hanging out with some friends, and then at some point, Nathan, Matthew, and her close friend Maurice would abduct her and bring her to Diggy for whatever else he had planned for her. But Nathan's dad had come home early before they could enact their plan, and so when that happened, Nathan had to sneak off and privately call Diggy and ask what to do next. And Diggy, who was totally frustrated by this, just said, you know what, bring her to Kevin's house and we will all deal with her when she gets here. So when Rachel sat down on the couch in Kevin's house next to Maurice and her other friends, who she thought she was just enjoying a fun night out with, in reality, they were all acting. They were trying to act like this was just another night and kind of get her off guard so that when Diggy came storming into the room pretending to be mad, which was the sign, they would all attack her. But now that the plan had worked and Rachel had fallen into their trap and had gotten badly beaten up and was restrained and helpless in the garage, Diggy didn't have a plan for what they were going to do next. So instead of doing anything, the 8 guys who had just beaten up and restrained Rachel just simply went back to doing drugs and drinking and playing video games in the living room. Then, a few hours later at 9 p.m., Kevin's girlfriend, Trissa Connor, she came home, and when she did, she entered the house through the garage. And when she saw Rachel laying on the ground, restrained, badly beaten up, her left eye is totally swollen, she ran over to her because, one, she actually didn't know who Rachel was. So this is just a random girl in her garage that's beaten up and restrained. And so she runs over to her, she rips the tape off of her mouth, she pulls the sock out, and right away Rachel is pleading with her to let her go, go. She won't tell anyone. And Trissa is totally confused because she really has no clue what's going on. She was not a part of the plan to harm this girl. And so Trissa just instinctively runs into the house. She does not make any contact with the guys in the living room. She goes straight into the kitchen and she gets a knife. And then she runs back into the garage and she begins cutting through all of Rachel's restraints to free her. But before she could finish the job, Diggy apparently had heard the commotion of Trissa coming in and heard her running around the house. And so Diggy comes storming into the garage. He sees what Trissa is doing. He runs over and he grabs her hands and he physically stops her from freeing Rachel. And then he threatens Trissa that he's going to harm her if she lets Rachel go. And so Trissa, amazingly, at this point, despite clearly seeing something very bad is happening to this girl, instead of continuing to try to fight this and figure out what's going on and maybe try to help this girl, she just gets mad at Diggy and says, I don't want this in my house. What are you doing? I don't want this girl in my house. You know what? I'm going to call the cops if you don't get rid of her. Meaning, I don't care what you do with her, but I don't want this in my house. I don't want to be involved with whatever this is. And then she promptly begins to leave Rachel alone with Diggy. She starts walking away, and Rachel, she's heartbroken. This was her way out. She was about to be let go, and now Trissa is leaving her behind. And so Rachel's begging her to come back. Please, you gotta let me go. But Trissa didn't listen. She walked into the house and shut the door behind her. And then Diggy, who was still in the garage, he just immediately turned around. He tied Rachel back up. He stuffed the sock back in her mouth. He taped her shut. And then he went right back into the house and shut the door, leaving Rachel all alone again. But a few minutes later, Diggy would come back, this time with John Whitaker, and the two of them would show up with this black duffel bag, this huge bag. And they walk over to Rachel, who's now whimpering in the corner. She'd kind of pushed herself to the side. And they lifted her up and they forced her small body into this black bag, and then they zipped it shut. And while they did this, Matthew Durham, who had been in the living room, he had gone outside and gotten his red Jeep, and he had backed it up to the closed garage door. And then once Diggy and John had Rachel secured in this bag, they opened the garage door up and they put her in the back of the Jeep and they shut the Jeep's back door. And then Diggy ordered John, along with Matthew and Rachel's friend Maurice, who had just come outside, to just go drive around town with Rachel in the trunk until he, Diggy, figured out what they were going to do next. And so the trio hopped in the red Jeep and did what their leader told them to do. They began driving around Everett with Rachel in the trunk. And this whole time, Rachel could clearly hear anything that was said inside of the vehicle, but apparently during this initial drive around, the trio didn't talk. So it's unclear if she understood who was actually with her. But eventually, during this drive around, one of the three young men in the Jeep got a call from Diggy, who told them he had his plan, so come pick him up. At this point, the trio decide, for whatever reason, to just dump Rachel somewhere, basically stash her somewhere in her bag, and go pick up Diggy. And then once they had Diggy, they would go back, they would get Rachel, and then they would figure out what they were going to do. They'd hear the plan that Diggy had in store. And so Matthew drove the red Jeep about 10 miles north of Everett to a quiet cul-de-sac in this suburban neighborhood. And then once the Jeep was stopped, Matthew and Maurice got out and they went around to the back of the Jeep, they opened it up, and they pulled Rachel out of the trunk and they walked her over and put her behind some big tree on someone's front property. Now, it's nighttime, this was not a well-lit up area, and so they thought by putting her behind this tree, she'd be out of sight of the road and, no one would see her. And they also decided that one of them would need to stay back and guard her to make sure she didn't escape or that nobody did accidentally find her. And they decided Maurice would be the one who would stay back and do that. And so after Rachel has been planted behind this tree, Maurice made his way over and he sat down next to her. And then Matthew and John, they just drove off in the Jeep to go get Diggy. And so once the Jeep had driven off, Rachel, who could clearly hear their discussions and she could hear the Jeep pulling off, she knows she is now alone with her good friend Maurice. And so this is her opportunity to plead with him to help her. And so as soon as she hears that Jeep is gone, she starts screaming through her gag on her mouth to try to get his attention, and it worked. Maurice quickly unzipped the bag and pulled her gag off, but he didn't untie her. And right away, Rachel, she is so upset, she's frantic, and she says to Maurice, "They're gonna kill me if you don't get me out of here. You have to free me." And Maurice was just very nonchalant, and he said, "Yeah, I think you're making a big deal about this. You're going to be fine. Just go along with it. It's not a big deal. But Rachel couldn't believe what she was hearing. And so she's saying, Maurice, don't you get it? They are going to kill me. This is the chance. Let me out. Save me. You're supposed to be my friend. Let me go. But Maurice just continued to do nothing. He just kept telling her it wasn't a big deal. She was blowing this up out of proportion. And then at some point, Rachel, after quite a bit of time had passed, and now she's thinking, Diggy and the others, they're going to be back soon. And so she says to Maurice, you know what? If they're going to kill me, I just don't want to be drowned. I'm terrified of being drowned. At least make them shoot me. Make it quick. And at this, Maurice just doesn't say anything. And instead, he reaches down and he grabs the sock and he puts it in Rachel's mouth. He puts the tape over her mouth and then he presses her down into the bag and he zips it shut. And then he waits for Diggy and the others to come back. And sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, Matthew, John, and Diggy returned in the Jeep to the cul-de-sac. They got out and they lifted Rachel up inside of the bag and they brought her back over and put her in the trunk of the Jeep, which now contained 4 new shovels. And then once the trunk was shut, all 4 men piled inside as well. And then Diggy told Matthew to head out to a particular off-roading spot he was familiar with. It was about 30 miles to the northeast. And over the course of this hour-long drive, Rachel could hear everything being said inside of this Jeep. And she would have heard all the details of exactly what Diggy had planned for her. And so she knows what's going to happen to her, but she can't do anything about it. She's just bound in the back of this Jeep. And so around midnight, they reached their destination, this off-roading site, which was basically this thick forest at the foot of a mountain near a small pond. And once they parked, the men got out, leaving Rachel in the trunk with the trunk shut, and they began walking around the back of the vehicle and started looking on the ground until Diggy said he had found a spot that he really liked, and it was about 10 or 15 feet behind the vehicle. And so once this spot was identified, the men walked back to the Jeep, they opened up the trunk, and they left Rachel, but they pulled out their shovels. Diggy, John, and Matthew, they all took their shovels and walked to this designated spot on the ground, and they began digging, but Maurice didn't. He stayed back at the Jeep, standing right against the trunk with Rachel right behind him. So again, he has this opportunity where, in theory, he could help Rachel, but while she whimpered behind him and tried to get his attention and tried to get him to help her, he just ignored her, and he pulled out a cigarette and he began smoking, and he also had a soda that he was drinking. And so he's just standing there doing nothing. And at some point, Diggy looks up and notices this, and he yells at Maurice to come help them, get your shovel and start digging. And so Maurice, reluctantly, puts a cigarette out, throws his soda can away, and then he grabbed the last remaining shovel, and then he walked away from Rachel and the Jeep over to this site, and he began to dig as well. For the next 30 minutes or so, Rachel, who's still in the trunk is open, she's still in the bag, she's forced to listen to the sound of these 4 people dig what sounds like a very sizable hole. And then when they finally stopped digging, she heard them chuck their shovels aside and start walking back over to her. And when they reached her, they unzipped the bag and they pulled her out and they sat her down on the back of this Jeep. So she's kind of sitting, looking in the direction of this dig site. And as they begin cutting off her restraints and removing the tape from her mouth, she gets a clear view of what they had been digging, and she knows immediately what it is. They were digging her grave. After all the restraints and everything was off of her, Diggy ordered John to start taking all of her clothes and jewelry off. Rachel knew at this point she was about to die. There was nothing she could do to stop it. She was outnumbered. She was in the middle of nowhere. She would have been overpowered. So she knows she's going to die. And so she had nothing to lose. And so when John grabbed her and tried to rip her clothes off, she fought back aggressively. And she looks at Diggy and she says, "At least allow me the dignity of removing my clothes and jewelry myself." And so Diggy looks at her and he says, "Fine." And so all of the men back up. And then Rachel, in front of these 4 people who earlier that day she would have considered her friends, she began taking all of her clothes off. And then after she had removed all of her clothes and all of her jewelry, she left one ring on her hand. And she clutched it with her other hand. And she looked at Diggy and said, "Can I please just keep this one?" The ring she was holding on to was a ring that her good friend Corey Haynes had given her right before he was killed in that car accident. And Diggy just says, "No." And he reaches out and he literally pulls it off of her hand. And so standing there completely naked and alone and terrified, Rachel was then ordered by Diggy to start walking towards the grave. And so Rachel, with as much grace as she could muster, stood up straight, took a deep breath, and began walking. And then she finally reached the edge of the grave, at which point Diggy told her to walk down inside. And so Rachel very carefully turned around and lowered herself down into the grave, and then she stood up in the middle of the grave with her back to her attackers, at which point Diggy said, "Get on your knees." And so she did this, and as soon as she was down on her knees, she looked skyward and she pressed her hands together and put them right up against her chest, and she began praying. And as she's looking upward towards the sky, Diggy laughs at her and says, "Don't worry, you'll be up there soon." And then Diggy pulled his gun out, he aimed it at her back, and he began firing the gun. And he shot several times into the back of her head, into her back, and then his gun jammed, at which point he cleared the jam, he reloaded his gun, and then fired even more shots into her body. And then he put his gun away, and he, along with the other 3 men who had just witnessed this and participated in this, used their shovels to fill the hole back in, covering her up. Once she was buried, the men rounded up all of her things, along with the shovels and the murder weapon, and they chucked it into the nearby pond. Diggy made sure to crush the ring Rachel had said was so important to her before he threw it into the water. Then the men climbed back into the red Jeep, and they drove back to Everett. And on the ride, Diggy would tell them that if they told anyone about what they had just done, he would kill them too. But just a few days later, after Rachel had been reported missing, the mother of Jeffrey Barth. Jeffrey was someone who had been at Kevin Jihad's house on the night Rachel was abducted, and he also played a role in her capture. His mother, Jeffrey Barth's mother, behind his back, went to police and told them that she thought her son knew something about Rachel's disappearance. And so the police, they rushed to Jeffrey and they interviewed him, and he would quickly say, "Oh, I don't know anything, but you should talk to Matthew Durham." Matthew, if you remember, was the driver the night Rachel was killed. He also helped dig her grave, and he witnessed her murder. And when police spoke to Matthew, at first he refused to speak and tried to act tough, but when the police ratcheted up the pressure, he cracked, and he told them everything, including where to find Rachel's body. And as soon as it became clear the police had Rachel's body, every other member of the Northwest Mafia who had been involved in Rachel's murder rushed to speak with the police because they were all trying to save themselves by blaming the other people in the group. And so that is why we have such a clear picture of exactly what happened to Rachel in her final moments, because those responsible told the police everything. During their trials, all 8 of the accused Northwest Mafia members were smug and did not take responsibility for their actions. But the worst of all of them by far was Diggy. During his trial, he smiled, and he even repeatedly turned around to look at Rachel's family so he could laugh at them and wink at them. Ultimately, all 8 of the accused were found guilty of various charges ranging from rendering criminal assistance all the way up to first-degree murder. 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace, whose home was supposed to be the site of the kidnapping, was sentenced to 116 days in jail. 20-year-old Tony Williams, who turned the volume of the music up to drown out Rachel's screams, and who also got the duct tape for Diggy when he was restraining Rachel in the garage, he received slightly more than 9 years in prison. 22-year-old Jeffrey Barth, who played a large role in subduing and kidnapping Rachel, and whose mother had gone to police and tipped them off about what had happened, he received 10 years in prison. 18-year-old Maurice Rivas, who was Rachel's closest friend in the group and who had pledged to support her and have her back as they got their lives together, he was sentenced to nearly 26 years in prison for assisting in Rachel's abduction and helping dig her grave. 17-year-old Matthew Durham, who drove the Jeep that carried Rachel to her death and who also helped dig Rachel's grave, he received 26 years in prison. 32-year-old Kevin Jihad, who was determined to have masterminded the finer details of the abduction and the murder, he was sentenced to nearly 37 years in prison. 22-year-old John Whitaker was sentenced to life in prison for being directly involved in the entire abduction and murder process. And 20-year-old John Diggy Anderson, the leader of the Northwest Mafia and Rachel's ex-boyfriend, he was also sentenced to life in prison for his role in her murder. Throughout Rachel's horrible ordeal, there were many people who could have stepped in and stopped what was happening to her, most notably Trissa Connor, who was Kevin Jihad's girlfriend and who found Rachel tied up in the garage, and Maurice Rivas, who was alone with Rachel in that cul-de-sac and could have easily freed her, but didn't. As a result of these heart-wrenching details, Rachel's family and their legal team worked very hard to pass a bill called SHB 1236. This bill makes it a criminal offense in America if you do not summon assistance for a person that has suffered substantial bodily harm. They are hoping this will save at least one person from suffering unnecessarily. Today, the Berkheimer family is still grieving the loss of their Rachel. However, her father, Bill, takes solace in a particular photograph the police showed him. After Rachel's gravesite was discovered and her body was removed from it, the police took a photo of the grave itself. And in this photo, you can see an imprint in the soil of Rachel's hands where she fell after she was shot. And it looks like her hands were pressed together near her chest, meaning she was likely praying in her final moments on Earth. And Bill likes to believe that means she was at peace when she finally died.